know, or can see, that the wage, equilibrium wage, is going to decline. So notice that a decline in the demand for labor in one industry, in this case autos, results in a decline in the wage rate in both industries. So if we thought about how this process would work, what we would see is with the lower demand for labor in the auto industry would begin to lay off workers. That would also push down wages in the auto industry. So you would get workers migrating to the food industry. With more workers in the food industry, with a fixed demand for labor in the food industry, that would also push wages down in that industry. We get to equilibrium where the wages are exactly the same. So we end up with this particular situation. So what do we have here then? Let's see what's happened. So we have a decline in the price of autos and no change in the price of food. We have a decline in the number of workers in the auto industry and an increase in the number of workers in the food industry. We have a decline of wages in the auto industry and a decline of wages in the food industry. Now let's think about the purchasing power of wages in the auto industry. So wages are down, but the prices of autos are down. So do we know anything about the relatives? That is this purchasing power of wages in terms of autos increased or decreased, or magically stayed the same? I'm sorry? Increase. Who's brave? So how do you know that that's an increase? By the way, you're correct, but how do you know that? Or was that just a lucky fill in the blank guess? That's TD. Yes?
Because the fall in real wage, the fall in wage is the same proportion that it fall at the initial point of labor portion, but it falls towards the other side. So the fall in wage is smaller in that proportion.
Okay. So what we know then is the percentage decline in prices and the percentage decline in wages we can think about, right? So if there were no change in the wage rate, that is, or if it had changed by exactly the same amount that prices did, so we could just think about this initial allocation of labor. So we've got this percentage decline in prices that shifts down the demand for labor curve in the auto industry. If wages were to, now remember that downward shift is only because of a change in price of autos. We set it up that way, make it simple. If wages fell by the same amount as prices did, then wages would also have to fall to this level, and there would be no change in the allocation of labor. But in fact, because this demand for labor curve is downward sloping, we can see that wages didn't fall as much. So wages do fall, but the price of autos falls even more. So the purchasing power of wages in terms of automobiles has actually increased. How about the purchasing power of wages in terms of food? I would hope that this is really obvious. Wages fell, and we assume that prices of food didn't change. Okay? So the purchasing power of a worker's wage in terms of food declined, while the purchasing power of a worker's wage in terms of automobiles has improved. Are workers better off or worse off? It's ambiguous, right? And what will it depend upon? How much food they buy compared to how many cars they buy, right? So it would depend upon the pattern of consumption here. If we bought lots of food, spent a huge proportion of our budget on food as opposed to automobiles, we'd be worse off in this particular case. If we spent a lot of our money on automobiles rather than food, we're really skinny, but we could get from place to place in a really shiny new car, then of course we would be better off. One thing to note here, we are better off in terms of workers. We're better off in terms of the good that we're importing. We're better off in terms of our import good, right? This is our import good. We're worse off in terms of our export good. Okay. So any questions about what happens to the allocation of labor in the United States, wages, distribution of income? You know whether you're better off or worse off? Yes. Okay. So remember, these are numbers up here, right? Might go from 0 to 100. So I'll throw in a couple of numbers here. Let's suppose that this was 20. And this was 100, right? Just to have numbers. So if we now have a 10% change in prices, if we had started up here, we're at this number, we go to 90, right? Which numerically, on a number scale, this would be minus 10. If we're down here at 20, which would be at this point right here on this demand for labor curve, then we have a 10% change in prices. We've now gone to 18, which is a change on the number scale of only minus 2. So here, this downward shift based on these numbers would be 2, and this downward shift from there down to here would be 10. So it's because we're using a percentage change against a numerical number. That difference will be much larger at higher numerical numbers than at lower ones. And that's why it's not parallel. Okay. Yes?
So the domestic producers that are left after the international trade union, does this kind of happen to be like the most efficient ones?
Oh, you mean in autos in this case? Right. So we've created an import competing industry right, when we open up the international trade, and that sector in which we have a comparative disadvantage. So notice that output shrinks. Now, we can think of that as happening in one of two ways. Every firm can survive but make less, or we can end up with fewer firms. If we ended up with fewer firms, it's which is normally, by the way, what happens. We end up with a smaller industry with fewer firms in it. It's typically the companies that survive are the most efficient companies in that industry because they have bigger profit margins. They can face up to the competition where a less efficient firm can't. Anything else? Okay. Now, this is still the U.S. But now we're looking at capital owners. Now, remember, the price of food is fixed, and the price of autos falls in the U.S. So here's our supply of capital. Here's our demand for capital. Our demand for capital is the nominal demand, so it includes the price level, which we see right here. So once again, with a lower price for automobiles, the demand for capital in the auto industry is going to decline. And again, it's not parallel, although I can... So the price of autos, this is the world price, times the marginal product of capital in the auto industry. So notice the first, maybe I shouldn't have said first because that tells you there's something else coming out. The first effect is there's a decline in the price of autos, which implies that there's a decline in the demand for capital. And that implies that there's a reduction in the rental rate on capital. No, it's not parallel, for exactly the same reason. Okay, so the downward shift, remember, this is a numerical scale. We're changing prices by some amount, so it's not a parallel shift. Actually, whether you draw it as parallel or not is probably not all that important, but it's not a parallel shift. Okay, so the first thing we can see, whether or not it's a parallel shift, is that a lower price for automobiles, notice, lowered the wage, that is, it lowered the return to the mobile factor of production. It also lowered the return to the factors of production that are specific to that industry. In this case, the auto industry, the factor that's specific is capital. So we've already seen that that factor has been reduced. Does anything else happen? It said one, so there must be a two. So what else do we know that's happening in the auto industry? Back in our previous diagram, right? We know the price is changing, but what else is happening? They're producing less. Okay, yes. There's fewer workers, right? So there are fewer workers in the auto industry. So what does that imply about the marginal product of capital that's in that industry? Decreases. Decreases? You sure? Decrease or increase? Decreases. Okay. So the marginal product of capital decreases. We've got fewer workers on each piece of the machine, so each machine now, with the fewer workers, is producing less output. So the marginal product of capital also falls. This, of course, means that the demand for capital falls, which means that the rental rate on capital will decline further. So notice that the owners of capital, in this case, the owners of the factor of production that are specific to the industry that's contracting, the one in which we have a comparative disadvantage in, it's shrinking industry. We've got more competition coming from foreigners. So the industry that's shrinking, because our resources are stuck in that industry, we can't move them anywhere else, we really get screwed. That, by the way, is a technical economic expression. It's in the glossary of your book, so if you don't know what it means, look it up. Okay, so look at this. Wow, they really get hosed, right? Boy, do I want to be a shareholder in these industries. If you don't think it doesn't work, think about what's happened to shareholders of General Motors or Ford or Chrysler. Well, that's right. We are all shareholders in two of those three companies because the federal government, therefore you and me as taxpayers, own big chunks of those two. Okay? But the rate of return for the shareholders, who are the ultimate owners of capital, has really gone down a lot. Prices, when you have lower prices, you have less revenue, so your return is going to be less. And then when the capital that you have already invested is not being used, but you still have to pay for it, right? General Motors still owns that big factory up in Flint, Michigan. Guess what? They still have to pay property taxes on it. They still have to pay a whole sorts of other sorts of expenses associated with it. So it's still an expense. So if you don't use it, it doesn't necessarily mean you get out of the expense of owning it. And so you end up taking another hit to your rate of return. If you want to think as an investor or a worker, which industries you might want to think about working in. Import competing industries, especially if you have skills that are highly specific to that industry, generally don't do you a lot of good. Okay, so notice what happens to the return, the relative return to capital owners versus the price of autos. The return to capital went down, the price of autos went down. Which one went down more? The return, right? The decline in the price of autos is reflected by this vertical shift here, which is only the first part of our reduction in the return to capital. So the owners of capital are worse off in terms of automobiles, the product that they make, but guess what? They're also worse off in terms of food. Their incomes have gone down, and the price of food has stayed the same. So the owners of the specific factor in the import competing industry are definitely worse off. Definitely worse off. Notice the workers in the auto industry, it's kind of ambiguous. Better to be a worker than a specific, better to be a mobile factor than a specific factor. Okay. Now let's think about U.S. landowners. So again, we've got a fixed amount of land. We've got our demand for land based on the price of food and the marginal product of land. Remember, our basic assumptions are the price of food is fixed and the price of autos falls. Anything happen? Or is this neutral? Are landowners better off, worse off, or neutral? The marginal product of land goes up. Why would the marginal product of land go up? Ah, we have more workers. Very good. Okay, so here we've got an increase in the number of workers in the food industry. With a fixed amount of land, that means that the marginal product of land has increased, which implies then that the demand for land will also increase. And that increase in the demand for land also implies that the return to landowners has increased. And again, if we thought about the purchasing power of landowners' income, we would see that the rental rate on land compared to the price of autos is way up. Our rental income's gone up and the price of autos has gone down. Yahoo, I hope we buy a lot of autos. And notice that even with respect to food, we're better off. That is, the return to the landowners has increased, while in our assumption the price of food has stayed constant. So the owners of land in the U.S., which produces food, our export good, the good in which we have a comparative advantage, are definitely better off. It's good to own a specific factor in an expanding industry. So again, what we can say is if the relative price of autos falls, workers can either be better off or worse off, depending upon the mix of their consumption. The owners of capital are definitely worse off, and the owners of land are definitely better off. Notice, import competing industry, export industry. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So what's going to happen in Japan? So if we think about Japanese labor, I got an idea. What are you guys working on? Why don't you take a few minutes and work on both the mobile factor and the two specific factors for Japan, and make sure you can work through the whole process, what happens to the returns for each of the factors of production, and I'll take a nap for a few minutes. Yeah, it's Thursday. Come on. Oh yeah, but we show that along the curve, right? So if I move from here to here, the curve shifted down, but it has this generally the same shape, right? So if it's not a price effect, when I move from here to here, that's an increase in the marginal product of labor. So it's in the curve.